Welcome and maloile day, talo falava everyone on this Friday for our side of the world, for Thursday for your side of the world. Tua, it's good to have the viewers join us today. We are live on YouTube, Facebook, Patreon, Instagram, and X. How's everything going on your side of the world, Tua?
It's been good. The weather is getting warmer. We have to make a introduction here real quick. We have another guest that will be joining us for the live show here very shortly. And it's
Okay.
Mr. Maui Tegelangi is going to join us. So we're going to add him real
Oh,
quick.
nice.
Let's
No,
see
that's
right
good.
here. Oh, yeah,
Special
way.
guest.
I'm joining you with Boba Fett, the bounty hunter, and Darth Vader. So you know
Darth
I'm
Vader.
at Lee's house.
Okay.
Good to have
Oh,
you. Good to have you.
they're all quoting and viewing Christianity or the new religion as foreign and as invasive, like an invasive species, and that it was a purely negative impact. And we're gonna watch this, and this is a reaction on the show, and I want to repeat this because we're gonna get people who say, "Oh, you guys hate this gentleman's name." I forgot his name. Masi knows his name really well. Manu Samoa, rugby player, has this podcast. We support their show, but like we said, just because we disagree about one or 2 points doesn't mean we don't like the people. Come on, we're human beings. We always disagree. So I'm gonna preface that for people out there who are gonna try and say we're trying to cut down people and so forth. But this is directly aligned with what we were talking about in the first half of the show, Maui.
A video that was sent into our group chat. Yes, we're jumping back into the Christian bag. There was a video that was shared on Breaking Waves podcast, which is Hannah's podcast, and it's the Choosing Faith, Tonga, Christianity, and Decolonization. Shall I play the whole video, or you just tell me when to stop and then?
Yep. It's not that long. It's a snippet.
Being a teacher, I always like to unpack the word or the meaning of, and the word decolonization means to become independent of the colonizers of a place. First and foremost, Tonga wasn't colonized, but there is debate around the fact that the Christian influence was a sense of colonization. But if you think about it in the history of our Tongan introductions into Christianity, it was a choice made, and our king chose Christianity. It was no enforced process or transaction that occurred. So we've got to be really careful of the use of those terminologies on specific Pacific groups. The blanket approach of decolonization, I get it, but when I speak from my Tongan spaces, we weren't colonized. We've never had to get independence from anybody, and we chose Christianity. And we chose it for very.
Pause it before we hear his response. Do you have any objections to anything she said or so forth before we get his thoughts here?
Yeah, like I've kind of mentioned before, that it's this Western born thought of decolonization. It all comes from academia. People in the Pacific Island studies academia space that think that Christianity was a form of colonization, which is true to a certain extent, because wherever the missionaries of these Western countries went, then the politics followed after, and colonization. But like I kind of mentioned, the situation of Tonga was a little bit different, was because like attracts like.
Mm-hmm.
Taufa'ahau leaders in Tonga, the priestly lineages of the ancient religion, saw the similarities of the ancient religion and the new religion, and they considered it one and the same. When they understood, I mean, the early Wesleyan missionaries in the early 1820s even wrote down certain religious ceremonies that Tongans practiced that, if I were to quote here, they would be saying like, that's impossible. That was a European influence. I was like, this was an observation of the first Christian missionaries.
Like George Vason especially was very clear.
Yeah,
he said there's many ancient
afterlife.
Israel practices that I see among these people.
And even the belief in the afterlife.
Yep.
George Vason, who was supposedly part of the first London Mission Society missionaries to land in Tonga in 1799, those missionaries didn't last too long. All of them left except George Vason, because he married the daughter of one of the Tu'iha, and he lived amongst the people. And they, him and his two close friends, they buried their third friend. And then after the ceremonies were done, and they went out fishing with his two buddies, and they're like, man, I wonder what so-and-so is doing in Pulotu, which is the Tongan word for the spirit world. And then George Vason, who just wanted to test their beliefs, asked them, and he says, you're speaking of him as if he's still alive, but we buried our friend last week. And then George Vason's two friends go through this long explanation trying to explain that every human has a body and a spirit, and the body dies, but the spirit lives on, and the spirit goes to a place called Pulotu. And the commentary of George Vason in his autobiography, when he gets back to Europe, he's like, these guys don't need conversion to Christianity. They already believe. They already have these Christian beliefs, and that's why there's this huge misunderstanding of the rest of academia of what actually happened in Tonga and why and how Tonga was converted. They don't know.
Yeah, 100%. And T style Malo, he says Christianity was a tool of conquest, Toko Maui. And
I already said that. I already accepted that. That's exactly what happened all across the world, but it's not what happened in Tonga.
Yeah, and I want to use that is Christianity, like you said, Maui, Christianity came first, and because Christianity was tied to Western nations, it was inevitable that the politics would come at some point, right? Yeah. But there are key unique things, and this is kind of goes along with what you were mentioning earlier about, a long, rich, ancient history of kingly lines and of priestly lines. Our ancestors had an understanding of that. They understood that the religion is not separate from the government and the politics, and these things are intertwined.
They are intertwined.
And you can't separate it, because you couldn't really separate that even within the Tongan system. And what I find interesting is that, like, here's an example. When Taufa'ahau and them, and they're putting together the tithing, right, for the Western religions, and they're going to send it overseas back to like Australia or something.
Yeah, it was to Australia.
Right? And then the Taufa'ahau and them are like, well, hold on. That doesn't make any sense. Right? It should stay here. And that may seem like a little thing, but it's that sensitivity to understanding how influence and religion and politics are intertwined, that was not seeing as just purely a religious play that has politics playing into it, and it was stopped.
Yes. And it's little things like that a lot of outsiders don't understand in the history of Tonga, and why Tonga was able to navigate the subtleties of the colonization period in the South Pacific is why Tonga was able to navigate these issues, because Tonga kind of used the same issues to maintain influence over all the neighboring islands. They kind of understood how religion and politics, because I mean, even what priests are called, priests in the ancient religion are called taula. That's what you call an ancient priest. And the concept of taula, or the role of ancient religion, it's because taula also means an anchor to society. It's something that kind of balances the boat when the seas are rough. It's religion that kind of helps maintain stability in any kind of civilization. If you want that civilization to grow and thrive and to remain stable, it takes religion. And when you break the word anchor or taula in two, it can also mean tau la, or to put up a sail. So this concept of religion and the role of priest to is similar to putting up a sail to a boat, or
Anchoring
putting
yourself.
an
Yeah.
anchor on a boat, are both things that you do to navigate rough seas, or to go to a certain destination that you want. The two aspects of religion play those delicate roles, and you need to know when it needs to play an anchoring role, or when it needs to play a wind in the sail role,
Driving new direction or whatever.
yes. And so it takes a delicate hand and understanding to navigate these situations. And because Tonga was able to maintain its traditional religion is in its purest original sense, is one of the reasons why the kings and chiefs of Tonga were able to work together as a crew on a ship to sail Tonga through the rough patches that the rest of the Pacific Islands were not able to navigate.
Yes. No, very interesting. So we got to laugh every once in a while, right?
Yeah.
And at every Kava session, there's some serious times. You got to break it up with some laughter. As always, Wada Bears never fails, our official PR guy, right? So he says, Wada Bear says the lost 116-page manuscripts are buried somewhere in Vaini. Manye Taufa'ahau bito e Kava ko e ni masi.
And you know, it's right on the next to the hopa tree on Wada Bear's ancestors' plantation.
Hi, malo, Wada Bears. I appreciate it. So now that we've kind of looked at it, and I think it's fair to say we don't have any major objections to what the lady expressed, right? Because she was kind of weary of, don't name it, call it decolonization. It has its issues, right? Now we're going to hear our brother here and what his analysis towards that statement.
You can follow this on the Breaking Waves podcast. Thoughts, Urs?
Yeah, nah, that's not true. That's not true. That's really off. And I say that respectfully, but there were massacres in Tonga. Massacres of people who did not accept Christianity. There was a massacre in Hule of over 300 people. Men, women, and children were all slaughtered. And she mentioned King George, right? Yeah, so Taufa'ahau, I think was his Tongan name. So the Wesleyan Church backed a chief like they did in Samoa, right? You know, the three powers all had three factions in Samoa, like they did in Hawaii with King Kamehameha. It's a technique they did everywhere in the Pacific, where they worked through a local chief or a powerful chief.
Right.
And
well, you just said this previously. They pick the one person that's got the power, and
yes, and then they work through him. And there's a massive book that even academics today talk about. It's by Peter Dillon, and he was there at the time. And they call it the Tongan Civil Wars of 1837. And he was there at the time, and he wrote a massive criticism of what the Wesleyan missionaries were doing and how they were putting Tongan against Tongan. And he wrote how disgusting what they were doing in supporting and encouraging King George Tupou to do the most atrocious crimes and to murder his own people, all for the church. You know, there were times where he would say himself that I'm only doing this for protection of Christianity, you know. So, and what he was doing was completely massacring people. There was the 300 people who got massacred in Hule, and that was simply because they did not accept Christianity. And Peter Dillon wrote this. He wrote, all for the crime of not embracing a religion that already that already created more bloodshed and more cruelty than any other event recorded in Tonga. So he was saying the crime that these people committed was that they did not accept Christianity. So they had to be slaughtered. Okay. And he slaughtered men, women, and children. And that's in Hule. That's
Initial thoughts, Maui.
Let me just say that the author of that book that he's quoting, that's what they say the war in Hule was about. But the war in Hule was not about Christianity. It was because the newly installed chief, Tu'iwakano, who is the chief of Nuku, and Nuku has a traditional fort called Hule. The people of Nuku threw their chief out.
They rejected the traditional chief.
They rejected their traditional chief, and Tupo the first was the, he's going to go. He was protecting the chiefs and the hierarchy of Tongan tradition. I mean, it's interesting because some of the and what he may not, and what the history books may not fully show is that there were actually some Christians inside the fort.
Oh, I didn't know that. There are actually Christians in the fort.
There were some. And Tupo the first said, and this is the only time that Tupo the first used this, because this was the first time, because it's a major no-no in Tongan tradition. The difference about the installation of high chiefly titles, of high chief titles in Tonga and Samoa, what's different is the Ainga in Samoa have the final say on who the chief is going to be. But in Tonga, it's the king who has the final say. The Ainga or the Ka'ainga don't have the final say on who the chief is. So once the king says that this is the chief, and that's why in Tonga it's a little bit different. The rules of succession are more strict father to son than it is. Only when there hasn't been
rare circumstance.
Only in rare circumstances. And the Kava ceremony up to this day reflects when a title goes from father to son, it's buttoned down, or it's
Whakama'o, like you mentioned. Yeah.
It's confirmed to that line, and the rules of father to son must go unless that line dies out. And then if a new person is installed, it's not going to be confirmed on that line unless the succession to his son happens once. So if it goes from brother to brother or cousin to uncle, it can hop around up to the prerogative of the monarch at the time. And so the fact that the legal monarch, the legal chief that was supported by the monarch to be the chief of Nuku and the war fort of Hule was not accepted by the Ka'ainga was the main reason. Because it's basically treason. And Tupo the first even said, we're not going to let one person, anybody who's inside the fort, they were given
opportunity to leave,
multiple opportunities to vacate the fort. And when they came, when the attack happened, when the final straw was on the camel's back and the camel's back was broken, the camel couldn't take it anymore, then Taufa'ahau came with his armies, and he said, everyone, and some of the missionaries that were with Taufa'ahau, they went and rescued a few young women or so.
Any Christians that they may have known or tried to convince them.
Yes.
Anyone they had influence over.
And so they tried to say, like, oh, this person's a Christian, they're, you shouldn't kill them. And then Taufa'ahau said, no, I said, in the camp. Anyone who was in the camp, they're treasonous. They're going to lose their life. And so even the missionaries tried to save a few people that they knew were Christian inside, but Taufa'ahau carried out the execution himself and said, my word must mean something. if my word doesn't mean anything, then what is the use of fighting this war? So if he said he gave them multiple opportunities to leave the fort and they didn't, they'll all be executed. And so, yes, there was religion involved, but like I said, the details of it, these academics outside of Tonga are definitely going to tell the story how they see fit and how they think Polynesian. And that's what's funny about Tonga is you have these academics trying to tell Tongans what their history is, and Tongans are like, actually, this is what happened. And so that's why you get these academics who are in these universities in New Zealand and Australia, and they read all these history books and they draw their own conclusions when they don't know of actual stories. And so it's interesting because it was known that Taufa'ahau said everyone that was in the fort will be killed. And tradition had maintained only until recently that everyone that was in the fort were killed, but there were actually 2 kids. Their mother was able to throw them outside the fort and hide them in a bush not far from the fort. There was a little hole and bush, and she buried a daughter and a son there just before the attacks happened, or while the attacks were happening. And those 2 kids went and lived with their relatives in Hihifo, and the families had been silent until recent generations. And this is how quiet histories are maintained in families. Everybody, it's like everybody in Hihifo and everybody who had relatives in Nuku knew, but they were quiet until what? It's like almost 200 years later. Then they start saying like, yeah, our ancestors were actually hidden and we've been quiet all this time to just pay respects to the king and not offend the king that two people that were inside the fort during the attack didn't actually survive.
Yeah, because his declaration
was they'll all be killed.
Yeah. Which is, unfortunately, I mean, in the Old Testament, that's not something that's not unheard of, right?
Well, and that's the truth. That's the truth of government and politics anywhere. Like,
yeah. That was what I was going to say. Is how is that only a Christian thing, right? When we listen to William Mariner and what he observed, right?
Yeah,
similar things. And I think, like you're saying, this is not a religious situation. This was a question about law and order. And, and at the time, the law was, this is your governor. And it would be no different if you rejected the governor and the law enforcement today, right? The federal government may come out and squash anything that's going on and reinstate law and order. And so that's something that's really interesting. I also thought it interesting that guy he's referencing almost sounds like an atheist, like a non-believer. And then here we are kind of going along with our theme. We're now referencing academic atheists that this is how you rebel, is to reject the faith of your quote unquote fathers, because it wasn't really the faith of your fathers. It was colonization. So the colonizers come and colonize you according to their minds. And then we're going to somehow believe they're here to decolonize us, when really all they're doing is recolonizing with a new idea in what they think we should be thinking.
That's exactly, you're kind of rephrasing what I've kind of tried to describe before. It's like they're using Western methods they're being told how to decolonize from a Western point of view and their understanding, and from the Western perspective of what decolonization should be. But I believe the true decolonization way of thinking and methods and methodology should come from a place that wasn't colonized. And so in a way, you can kind of almost eliminate everybody who comes from an island or a background that is in the Western frame of mind or framework.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's come back and give him some more opportunity to describe his position, and we'll feed back. And like we said, we love their podcast, we love their show. We're just trying to have a conversation here and see what other perspectives are.
So Hule, Massacre. There was another one in Ngeleia. These ones were in Tonga Tapu. So this is the main island where he slaughtered, I think it's 40 to 60 people, men, women, and children, cut their heads off and sent it to one of the rebel leaders, as a warning. You have to embrace Christianity or this is going to happen to you. The idea that Tongans chose freely to accept Christianity is a lie. That's a horrendous lie, because many Tongans stood up and fought for their own traditional practices, and they were murdered because of it, because they did not accept Christianity. They chose not to, and they were murdered. All right, so
the example that he's bringing up about the heads being, see, he doesn't.
Yeah.
He doesn't. Well, he's mixing up the stories a little bit, because the fort in Ngeleia was overcome without any bloodshed. He's talking about a war that happened at Siako Veongo in Nuku'alofa, and a chief from the Tautahi had so much respect for the Tu'ikanukupolu because they were on a war campaign together, and there was only one chestnut left, one ifi left of the food, and they had been fighting wars and there wasn't much food, and so the leftover ifi that was left, or chestnut that was left from the umu, the whole army saved it for the king, but one of the captains of the army hadn't received his portion. And when the king was delivered his one chestnut, and then he said, I need to give this to the captain. And then the captain said, I can't eat it without the king not having a piece. So they broke the chestnut in half, and they both had half a chestnut. And so some years later, they happened to be on opposite sides of the war in Kolomotu'a, because the Tu'ikanukupolu is at Kolomotu'a, and he's coming with Ulukalala and the Tautahi. And they were told to go and patrol one flank of the...
Who's they?
Makau'i To'a and some of the party from the Tautahi that came with Ulukalala.
Okay.
So the people of Kolomotu'a and Nuku'alofa were inside the fort.
Okay.
And so when the Tautahi came with Ulukalala from the northern islands, Makau'i and patrol was told to go around the flank and make sure that no one went in or out. And two of the warriors didn't listen to Makau'i in the scout party. And because they didn't listen to what he said, he killed them and cut off their heads and then delivered it to the Tu'ikanukupolu. He personally delivered it. And when he delivered the two heads, and then he told the Tu'ikanukupolu, he said, I'm sorry, happened to be on the wrong side of this this fight, this battle, but I cannot forget the half ifi you gave me in from the leftover umu. I didn't deserve any of it, but you gave me half. And so he said, this is my gift to you. Yeah, this is my gift to you for giving the half ifi. He gave a totally wrong description that the two heads were delivered because they didn't accept Christianity. That's not what happened. What's happened was, it was a king and one of his captains in previous war that happened to be on opposite sides of the fence this one time, and he had two warriors that didn't listen to him exactly, so he decided, I'm going to sacrifice them, and that's going to be my assistance to the king that I love. But because of where I live and where I'm from, I have to fight the battle from the islands, because I'm from the outer islands. And you know, it's called Inasi Ulu. And you know, Grand Uncle Ulu Amu?
Yes, that's where his name comes from.
That's where his name comes from. It means the cut off head. And Ulu Amu was actually a twin when he was born, but the younger twin died as a baby. And they were named Ulu Amu and Ulu Ave because of the 2 cut off heads that were delivered in symbolic and payment for the kind gesture that the king had given one of his previous captains. And so that's what Uluamu and Ulu'ave is about, and what the story of Inasi Ulu, the delivering and gift of the 2 heads, was about. It had nothing to do about Christianity.
See, and this is, I think that's a very important thread to pull on, Maui, because this is not only seen to be true about this discussion, but of oral history. And when Westerners, we appreciate that they tried to document whatever they could or whatever, but we have to take it with a grain of salt, right? So this is the problem of just taking the quote unquote written down history that the academics and the early Christians had, and then using that lens to explain our history and our origins and where we come from and why we behave the way we behave, because it really distorts it to a great degree. Like you're saying here, we're not saying that our brother here is lying. What we're saying is his sources that led to his understanding did not understand the situation, did not have the context or direct ability to really understand what was going on.
Yeah. And incomplete information.
Yes. One thing I want to talk about real quick, because I do find it very, very interesting. William Mariner talks about this in his book. And that is this idea of family and friends on opposite sides of the battle, right?
Yeah.
Where I find that a very interesting mindset, that they would come and they would actually have like a feast, a little gather together, right? Kind of like what you're saying, 2 very close friends. They not only respect the lover, but there's a genuine love for each other, but they also recognize I have a duty and I have a job.
Yeah.
Right. So I find that very interesting, because to me, the only way you can develop such a mentality is by understanding Christ-like or Christian concepts of mortality, right? Like, we literally could be killing each other, but that is not an ultimate representation of my respect for you and so forth. And I need to just keep my responsibility. And I think another reason behind, the only way you can think like that is if you have an understanding that there's so much more than this life. Okay? There's certain things about this life. We'll have our little scuffles. We might kill each other, but the longer view, the eternal view, when we're on the other side, we're going to be fine. We don't have to fight on the other side. We'll be good on the other side, but we got to keep our duty is so important, and that may have played a significant role on how Tonga was able to maintain itself and why it was so stable. It is that religious understanding and that commitment to duty and honor that leads to stability. Just some thoughts on that. Anything you want to say to that, Maui, before we continue?
And I think the famous words of the rock ring true, and you can tell that it's spoken from a truly Polynesian perspective, and WrestleMania loves it and the whole world loves it, but it gives new meaning when you understand where it comes from. Knowing your role.
Yeah.
When you know your role and the duty that you have to play in certain situations, you know, you can do things with respect and with disrespect. And then when misunderstandings happen and then problems are out of the way, because you conducted your way in such a manner or a respectable, honorable way, things can be mended afterwards. And so knowing your role, I always laughed when The Rock used to always say it, because I was like, yep, you know, he grew up with a Samoan mother when you know that.
No, 100%. And that really is what, like you said, that is what one could describe as a root principle that will allow for flourishing after the storm.
Yeah.
Right. When the storm clears, there's an opportunity to continue. All right, let's continue here because he has more to say.
Free choice. Oh, okay. You know, they didn't freely choose Christianity. If you chose something else, you were dead. You had your head cut off. And the description of what they did to the women, ripping their bodies open and things like that. And he sends a warning. And one of his, I think it's in the islands of Ha'apai. And he's fighting, I forgot the leader's name, sorry. And he sends a warning. I have the Pulu Papalangi. I have the Palangi's bullets. You know? So he is being weaponized and armed by the church, just like Malia Tor was in Samoa. The very first thing that John Williams gave Malia Tor in Samoa wasn't a Bible. The very first thing were two guns, a blunderbuss and a musket. All right. So the church, they have this plan that they're doing around the world, is getting indigenous people to destroy indigenous people and to champion Christianity. And any type of resistance must be slaughtered. There must be no person alive that believes in the traditions. And there is a quote by a bishop, I forgot his name, but he says, man, Tongans must be dumb because they prefer the destruction of their own culture, of themselves. They would rather die than accept our Christian God. You know what I mean? So there were thousands of Tongans who said, no, we do not accept Christianity. We would rather die than accept Christianity.
Any thoughts on that?
It's, I mean, all due respect, but Taufa'ahau did not get his guns from the missionaries. His guns were from his grandfather's lieutenant, who was the chief of Ewa, Kaufana. Kaufana had sacked a number. I think the island of Ewa has the record number of European boats sacked. And from the boats, he had cannons and rifles. And so when he was having at the sort of the beginning of the tail end of the civil war that happened in Tonga for 3 generations, and that's what a lot of these academics are not willing to accept, is that the civil wars that happened in Tonga predated
their arrival,
the arrival of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And so it started with Taufa'ahau's grandfather, Tuku'ahau, who was Tu'ikanukupolu, came down to his father, who was Tu'ikanukupolu, and then the 3rd generation of the Civil War was Taufa'ahau, or Nginingini Ofolanga, before he left Ahau, and the tutelage of Kautai, or the family of Kautai, is kind of the background of what was going on. And so Christianity and the missionaries were working during Taufa'ahau's time. And so there was already a civil war going on. And when the civil war in Ha'apai was going on, which was the beginnings of the wars of Taufa'ahau, he went to his grandfather's lieutenant in the island of Ewa and asked for the cannons and rifles. And so the cannons were Me'afana Whakafonua, and then the rifles were called Laifone. One of Taufa'ahau's sons, Prince Laifone, that's what Laifone means. It was the original name of rifle.
Rifle. That's how they pronounce rifle. That
they called the rifle Laifone. And so he went and got rifles and cannons from his grandfather's lieutenant, who was also the chief over Eua, to help him with his battles in Ha'apai. And there's a whole many stories, different stories about that. But like Taufa'ahau was not given weapons from the Christian missionaries. He got them on his own accord for political reasons that he had inherited from his grandfather and father.
Yeah, and I mean, just to further push that, I mean, we look at William Mariner. right? The exercise of sacking European ships for weapons
Yeah, that's
is
what
nothing new.
no, and that's Mariner was talking about that, because Mariner was on one of the ships that were sacked, and they were sacked for the guns.
Yes.
But all of the early European ships that came through Tonga, Captain Cook would call Tonga the Friendly Islands because they were more friendly and more peaceful than all the other islands that they had visited. And but the civil war that started right after Captain James Cook had gone through Tonga 3 times, it was all political, that just happened to happen at the time, at the tail end of the Civil War period, when the missionaries came.
Yeah. And just, I mean, when you just kind of sit back and you just listen and pay attention to what's being described here versus what Tupou the First actually did, and his personal experience with the miracles.
Yeah.
This is why it's important to have conversations, right? This is why Kava sessions are so important. You get to hear different ideas, and we like to say here, right? Like, if you just heard this brother's position, it's like this guy who first shows up with the jujitsu, right? He's like choking everybody. He's doing great. But then as the idea goes on, all of a sudden another idea comes up with a different style, right? And all of a sudden the weaknesses of jujitsu is exposed. Then you have, yes. And then there's all these different, that's why we have mixed martial arts, right? You're trying to find the best pieces, the best arguments from all over the corner to develop a style that is has the most resistance to error, right? Or misunderstanding. And that's why it's important to have these conversations, because if we don't, then you could end up just reading what an external observer's position is, and then you totally miss what was actually going on. So let's continue here and try and get through this this section here of his thoughts.
And they died. Okay, so these massacres are not taught. Like, no one knows about these massacres. No one knows about the battle of Velata as well, is another one. And the funny thing is that King Tupou, he must have been an accomplished sailor, because him and his army are sailing to these islands. If you see Tonga's not one island. It's many islands. They might have the most islands in the Pacific, but they have a lot of islands. And so he's sailing to them all. And he's going there and just wiping them out, man. Like dude was full on. So the irony is that he's got his warriors who all have alia or kalia, these massive sailboats, and they're all tatted up, and they're killing all the people who believe in the traditional customs. And then he installs a code of Ava'u, and he installs all these laws that ban tattooing, that ban navigation, and ban traditional dances and traditional ceremonies. And if you do them, you're gonna be killed. Like,
that's pretty hyperbolic, man. I don't know if that was actually you danced a dance, you got killed. And the Battle of Velata that nobody knows, I was like, that's a little bit out of left field. That really doesn't have anything to do with anything.
The Battle of Velata is the ones that he went and got the guns from his lieutenant, his grandfather's lieutenant in Ewa, the Meafana Fafanua, which were the cannons and the rifles, the Laifone. And this is how smart Taufa'ahau was to appease the missionaries. And appeasing the missionaries was not because they believed in it, because they knew a dance is just a dance. But the missionaries believed that the dance were tied to the ancient
satanic worship or whatever.
Worship or heathenistic worship. And so he did ban the traditional dancing to appease the missionaries, which was to appease the foreign military vessels that would come in. So they would only say good things about the ruler. But the other side of the coin is, and where the ancient traditional chiefs and kingling lines of Tonga, of the Tu'ihataqalawa line and the Tu'itonga line, played their role in reviving the ancient dances, and they did it in a very subtle way, saying that these are new invented dances for the modern Christian Tongan, but it was basically the same traditional dances, but they just they put a little lipstick on it and renamed it, and they
Put
said
lipstick on the pig.
This is a new traditional dance that we've created for the modern Tongan, Christian Tongan. And it was basically the Me'elaufola became the Lakalaka, you know. The Otuhaka became the Ma'ulu'ulu. It was just they repackaged it and renamed it to satisfy the missionaries, but it was basically the traditional songs, the traditional ideas, and everything else with it. And that's the Tongan way of politicking without shaking the boat, or you know, to just keep the boat stable. But we all know how to play this game together, and we know what's best for our country. But at the same time, we understand what the leader's trying to do, and he can do it. But we're going to reinvent the traditional dances so that it's acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
It's acceptable under the noses of these missionary Christian missionaries to Tonga.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that's something that we also have to be really aware of and really appreciate, is a very difficult skill, right? But very necessary skill as a general, as a politician, is knowing where the battles are going to be that matter.
Yeah.
And where the battle will happen.
Yeah.
Right? Like forcing where the battle will happen. And that's one of the things that, you know, like you'll use this phrase. You remember the Antonio Bandera with the Mask of Zorro at the very beginning, when he sees the guy that killed his brother, right? And he's like half drunk and he's gonna go kill the American military guy, and he's gonna run at him, and then the old Zorro stops him, right? And says, "You would have fought very bravely and died very quickly." Right? And then tells him, "Let it go. There will be a time for that. But until then, come with me. Let me teach you how to fight. Let me teach you how to understand where, when, and where the battles need to happen and where you concede." I always laugh when I see online the Tongans were a bunch of cowards. They were a bunch of, they just folded over. Look at the Ha'amoa. They had a fight, over there in Ha'amoa, and even beat some of the Germans or whatever. The Maoris were fighting over there, the English, and even were winning the battle. And then I go, and you won the battle, but what was the final outcome of the war?
Lost
Colonization.
The war.
Exactly.
Won the battle, lost the war.
Lost the war. And you can point the finger, you can disagree with the strategy that Bo the First, and I strongly believe in what you said. And this is one of the things that one of the many pearls I've kind of come across in doing the podcast is a tremendous appreciation for Tu'itonga and the Tu'ihataqalaua, and how I the best way I can describe it is the parting gift that Laufiri Tonga gives Tonga as the last Tu'itonga is akin, and I don't want to sound sacrilegious, but to the atonement. It is a self-sacrificing, forward-looking, and a preservation effort by him. And you can argue with, you think this was wimpy, or you thought, we shouldn't have conceded the dancing and the tattoos. Well, my humble opinion, if I had a choice to keep tattoos, to keep the name of the traditional dances and keep or maintain self-governance, maintain sovereignty, easy fix. Comes back to the analogy that you said. If all I'm giving up are the branches in order for the root to survive, easy choice. It's painful, it sucks, it takes patience, it takes diligence, it takes all this stuff.
And it's ugly. It's ugly.
Yeah.
You know, the beauty of a plant is its branches and leaves. You take away the branches and leaves, it's ugly.
Yeah.
But it may be necessary if it saves the root.
And that's the thing that I think is important. And like you were mentioning earlier, in the short term, duty is ugly. It's painful and it doesn't look pretty in the short term, right? Like we were talking about. Yes, I have my duty, right? But I'm going to do it respectfully. I'm going to do it in the best way possible for the future. It is a long-term play. And that's one of the things that you don't develop that type of understanding overnight. And even for a civilization, it doesn't develop in hundreds of years. It develops in thousands of years of being able to do that. And one of many reasons why we are fortunate to have a portion of the Polynesian Empire survive to this day. See, all right, let's continue here with our brother.
It's a lie. It is not true that it was a choice. Now, in terms of decolonization, I think Tongans have a lot of culture. Like, decolonization is a spectrum, man. It's not like you either are or you aren't. Like, man, they've kept a lot of their culture, man. Really awesome, man. They're awesome. But in terms of this, that Christianity is a choice, perhaps for this generation and the recent generations. But for that generation that had the missionaries coming, who had to deal with the Christian king, that he was compared to King Saul, you know, and he was backed by a missionary called John Thomas, and he was funded. And this is who Peter Dillon was criticizing. He sent letters to the London Committee. Look at the crimes, the atrocious crimes your missionaries are pushing this man to commit. What are you doing? You guys shouldn't be doing this. And even to this day, nearly 200 years later, academics are talking about Peter Dillon and what he said about what these missionaries were doing in order to destroy the traditional culture of the Tongan people and to absolutely mutilate and exterminate anybody who followed the traditional ways. And they were slaughtered, massacred, every single person in these.
You had something to say there?
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of the negative things said about Tupou the First by the Methodist missionaries, it was when he was moving
away
to stop the flow of the missionary funds or the church funds that were collected in Tonga being sent to the Sydney Conference, which was basically funding the missionary effort in the entire South Pacific. Tonga was actually, it was the money and also missionaries from Tonga that was converting the Aboriginals, the Melanesian countries, the Micronesian countries.
I did not know that.
And in the beginning it was okay, but then when the amounts were just getting to, you know, ridiculous amounts of money flowing out, like that's when Tupou the First was like, hey, we need to maintain more of that money in Tonga. That money is the economic strength of Tonga is actually building the missionary effort in Australia and abroad. But Tonga needs some stabilization, economic stabilization. And you know the interesting thing, Tua, 75% of the money collected by the churches in Tonga were being sent to were being sent to Australia. But Tonga actually needed 50% of those funds to break even. So first Taufa'ahau was like, at least take only 50%. so it can be at least we break
So we
even
can stabilize the
for the
economy.
expenses of the church in Tonga. And Australia said no. They maintained it at 75%. And so what Taufa'ahau did, they had a separate fundraising every quarter to cover that one quarter, and that's where the li kuata comes from.
Mm.
You know how every quarter they have little fundraising, and each household gives a few dollars, and they said tanaki kuata, and they collected money, a separate collection of money from the main collection that's held once a year. And that's why it was called the whakakuata, because some people think it's because it was collected quarterly. It was actually called the whakakuata because to get that 25% or that one quarter that was needed to maintain
The government.
the expense of the church. This is
Oh,
just
of the church. Okay.
And so that's where the Tanaki Kuata came from. And then Tupo the first just kind of did that for a number of years before they decided to pull out of the Sydney conference from the Methodist Church, and Tonga created its own conference, the Tonga Conference of the Methodist Church, which of course upset all the missionary effort in
Because
the
that
South
shook up everything. So
because
go ahead.
and so that's when you get missionaries starting to say negative things about Tupo the First, that he was a murderer and he was killing people, and
Yeah.
it wasn't because he was being a bad guy. It was because he was stopping the flow of funds to the Methodist Center in Sydney.
So basically there's two things that come to mind. So basically we're saying that Taufa'ahau was installing Make Tonga Great Again before Uncle Donald.
I think Uncle Donald was taking one out of the book of Taufa'ahau Tupo the First.
Taufa'ahau, yes.
Because Taufa'ahau was making Tonga great again back then by saying Tonga for Tongans.
Yes, he was putting tariffs on the religion, on the church, right? It's like we're going to put tariffs and we're going to bring back religion to Tonga where it was before. We were losing all of our religion to Sydney and the resources for cheap doctrine. We were going to in-house that. So I thought that was pretty funny. The other thing too is, now look, we are by no means, and I think by the explanation that Maui gave here, is we are by no means defending all the actions of every missionary and every decision by the churches. The churches have their own politics, like Maui's mentioning here. They were all happy when the money was coming, right? And all of a sudden the money's not coming. All of a sudden the politics changes, right? And all of a sudden he's the bad guy. But this is the significance of whether you want to call it inspiration or you want to call it political know-how and administrative know-how, fighting the right battles at the right time. Your friend is your enemy, that your potential enemy that has similar alignment at a certain point, you align with them. At a certain point, there was an alignment between the missionaries and Taufa'ahau, but guess what? After some time, that alignment was no longer aligned, and you make another deal, you move on, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That we exercise that every day in how we behave in business. Some people take it to the extent to every relationship that they have. But to me, that is a indication of understanding which battles are the priority, right? And which battles, and going back to the comment earlier, why is it that they were able to do that? The example of the two heads and the ifi broken in two is a prime example of that. Yeah. These guys were best friends when they were aligned, but sometimes duty is duty. Just like Donald Trump thinks his responsibility is to the average American voter, America first, right? If I gotta make decisions that hurts Wall Street and so forth, but I'm gonna protect what I think are the interests of the people, is what Taufa'ahau did when the religion, quote unquote, was no longer serving the interest of his people. And if God is God, and it's the same God that we pray to in Tonga, then the same God that we choose to separate from, we'll figure something out, right? But we don't have to just blindly concede all this power and influence and monetary gain just because someone helped you 20 years ago. So I think there's always a different angle to look at things. Any thoughts on that, Daniel, or we want to jump back into the video?
Let's jump back into the video, but it's getting pretty old fast.
Yes. But we just don't want if they see this, we don't want to say, "Oh, you didn't listen to my whole argument." I at least agree with his part that colonization is a spectrum, right?
Yeah, it is. It is.
And I would agree with that. And that's what we're talking about is along that spectrum, where can I concede and where do I need to hold?
Yeah.
And that can change day to day, year over year, or whatever the situation is.
Forts in Hule, in Ngeli'ia, in Tongatapu, every single person was killed. There were no survivors. Heads were sent to rebel leaders.
Which is false in Ngeli'ia, by the way.
It is. It's a lie. That's not true. Maybe for this generation, yeah, you have a degree of choice, and I feel it. I feel like I can choose. But the generations before, the real generation that had to deal with the missionaries arriving with their guns, same in Samoa, our people did what they had to do to survive. All right, we will convert because, man, I don't want to see my kids' heads cut off like they were in Hule. All right, I don't want to see my family massacred. I will convert. There's no choice.
You can find
interesting. So that's pretty much the end of the video there. Kind of doesn't align with what Pita V did, right? He made a choice. He was a commoner. He jumped into the water. He was willing to die for his Christianity. No one was killing Pita V, right? And so and here's the other thing I find ironic. What were our ancestors doing before anyway if you didn't want to concede to them and they were a powerful chief? They were killing you anyway, right? Like, what's the difference in Europe? When a king didn't like what another king said and they had an argument, guess what they did? They killed each other. I mean, we have to figure out where it's just human behavior versus everything was from the Western religion. But any closing thoughts, Maui? And I think we've hit the time here, but this has been a great discussion.
Well, it would be an interesting discussion to discuss with Samoans, even the Tongan policy on the rule over Samoa and what they understand, or what the Makai and chiefs of Samoa allowed their people to understand from the perspective of Tonga of what really happened.
That would be very interesting.
And so it's interesting because the comments that he made are strictly from the academic point of view of the interpretations of academics of what they seem to have read of contemporaries of Taufa'ahau have written. And so you can see a lot of the academic or Western interpretation of what happened being retold in a lot of the things that he was saying. And it's interesting that he wants to give a decolonized perspective by reading what the colonizers and Western academics have said. I would like to see how many Tongans he consulted before he gave his opinion and all these things. And I'm pretty sure that maybe he didn't even consult one.
Yeah.
And so that's what's so amazing about these ideas of decolonization. And it's funny because even the terminology that's being come up in South Pacific study academics, which is mostly by Palangis and Polynesian islanders who are being educated at the highest echelons of these education institutions. It's strictly from a Western perspective, and it's not entirely true, and it's not a truly decolonized perspective, even though you may speak it, but you're definitely still looking out of the same window.
No, 100%. And maybe the Lord was onto something when he said, you will know them by their words. He said you'll know them by their fruits.
I'm surprised there wasn't more questions, or maybe we've gone off at the
deep. No, there are a lot of comments and questions. I just stopped because if not, like right now, there's probably over 100 comments from Facebook and YouTube. If I went to the comments, we wouldn't have finished the videos, and we would have hit 3 hours, which sometimes happens on the podcast. But my closing thoughts are the Kava culture of coming together, sharing ideas, this idea of the podcast and people discussing ideas, something our ancestors have been doing for thousands and thousands of years. And like we mentioned earlier, just because someone said something that sounds good and it might make you feel good right off the bat, like I need to decolonize myself. Take a deep breath, listen to it, and then say, well, what are other ideas out there? What do I observe? What do I see? And what are those fruits are, and really just ponder it, just think about it, and then go join a Kava conversation in your neighborhood.
Yeah. And, let's keep on inviting these people to the Polynesian Ice Podcast live digital Kava sessions.
Yes.
This is the modern Kava circle. And when you come to the Kava circle, everybody's open and welcome, and everybody, it's definitely a Kava session rule. Everyone has to keep an open mind.
Yes, 100%. And like always, be bold, ask the hard questions, and let the ideas do the fighting. If you got an idea that you think has a new technique and a new move, bring it. Let's test it out and let's see how fun it performs. We like the UFC to see different styles and new ideas, new skills. No different. It's just a mental MMA when you come to the digital Kava sessions here on the Polynesian Ice Podcast. With that being said, thank you all, everyone. Appreciate the comments, the interaction. We try to integrate it as much as we can. But until next time, peace.
Ovadu.
Ovadu.